Okay, so we are going to look at the posted homework problem called Distance and Displacement 1. And that reads, Jeanie needs a new pair of jeans. She leaves home, we'll call that point A, and drives due east to the store, point B. The store is 5 kilometers away. She then drives to store C, which is 7.5 kilometers due east from her home. She finds that store B had the lower price, so she heads back to purchase the jeans. She then heads home. Part 1, draw a picture and identify the world setting the origin and identify where Jeanie's house is as well as the two stores. So we're going to look on that horizontal plane. So here's our horizontal plane. It tells us that the stores are east in both cases. So they will be to the right of Jeanie's house. So we'll put Jeanie's house here and we'll store A. The first store is 5 kilometers away. So we called that point B. This was point A, her house. Here's the first store. We'll call that point B. And then it says the second store, C, is 7.5 kilometers from her house. So if this is her house, it's a little bit further than store B. So we'll call that store C. So here's the picture of where things are in space, and now we have to set the origin. We get to choose, and then every position is relative to that origin. So I'm going to set the origin at Jeanie's house. I could have chosen anywhere. It's my choice, but I'm going to set it at Jeanie's house so that everything can be relative to where she started out in this particular example. Well, if this is Jeanie's house, it told us that store B, point B, was 5 kilometers away, so this then must be position positive 5 kilometers, given that it is to the right, it is east. East is positive of the origin, and, east in this example is going to be to the right of the origin because B is east, and spot C is at 7.5 kilometers. All right, 7.5 kilometers east to the right of her home. So that's part A. Part 2 says, examine ideas about both distance and displacement. What is the distance Jeanie traveled to store B? The distance she traveled to store B the first time. So we want to be able to distinguish between distance and displacement. That's the point of this exercise. So let's just remind ourselves that distance is the total lengths. Displacement, and these are good times to pause, check yourself, and then see if you are consistent with the video. Displacement is our change in position, our start relative to our finish, and it's our final position mathematically minus our initial position in a given motion. So what is the distance Jeanie traveled to store B the first time? Well, let's just kind of remind ourselves what she does. She starts here at her home. She travels to store B, checks out prices. Travels to store C, checks out prices. So she's moving in this direction. Then she goes back to store B to purchase the clothes, and ultimately she heads home. That's sort of her path and her different stops. So the first time, what distance did she travel to store B? What was her total length? So the first time she goes from her home to store B in one fell swoop. So this is question 2A, distance from her home to store B, and it's 5 kilometers. So her total length is 5 kilometers. What is the displacement she had when she went from store B to store C? So this is part 2B. So her initial position is going to be went from B to C, point B to C. So she starts at store B, which is at 5 kilometers, the position in space. Her final position, she ends at store C, which is at position 7.5 kilometers. So if I want her displacement between B and C, I take her final position minus her initial position, 7.5 minus 5, and her displacement is 2.5 kilometers. It's positive, so it's 2.5 kilometers east, or positive in our coordinate system. Good. What is the displacement Jeanie had when she went from store C back to store B? So now we're looking at the motion. This is part 2C, where she's starting at store C. Well, store C is 7.5 kilometers. And she's ending her final position at B, which is 5 kilometers. So if we're looking at her displacement, it's always the final position minus the initial position. My final position is 5. My initial position is 7.5, and I get a negative 2.5 kilometers. That negative tells me she moved to the west. So the same magnitude, the same size of motion, she traveled the same amount of length, distance in this case, but she's going in opposite directions, different directions. So the displacement is truly different in this case. What's the total distance Jeanie traveled when she arrived at store B for the second time? So the total distance from the beginning until the end. So this is part 2D. Well, we have to add those total lengths. So she goes to store B, that's 5. Then she goes from B to C. Well, the length between B and C is 2.5. Then she goes back to store B and is there the second time. So we see she travels a total distance of 10 kilometers, just adding up those lengths. What is the total displacement Jeanie traveled when she arrived at store B for the second time? So total over the course of the whole motion. So this is 2E. Again, displacement is initial position and final position are important. So she starts out at home, if we're looking over the course of the whole motion, at home, which is position 0 kilometers. She ends at store B, which we've already determined was at the 0.5 kilometers. And so if we look at our displacement, we see the final position is 5 minus my initial position of 0, a positive 5 kilometers. So she ended east of where she started, and indeed she did. She ended at the store. All right, part F reads, what was the displacement Jeanie traveled between store B and when she headed home? So we'll be up here at 2F. Again, we have to identify our initial and final positions. She started at store B, so store B is at 5 kilometers, and she ended up at home, 0 kilometers. So if we look at our displacement, our final position minus our initial position, we have our final position of 0 minus our initial position of 5, negative 5 kilometers, which tells us that she is west of where she started. She had a leftward or a westward displacement. All right, a couple more just to fully get this idea. Part G says, what was Jeanie's total distance? All of the lengths through the whole motion of her shopping experience. So we add those up. She started at 0. She went to 5. That's a length of 5. Then she went to 7.5 kilometers position, so she went at 2.5 more kilometers. She went back to 5, another 2.5 kilometers, and then she went home, which was 5 kilometers. And so we see that she had a total distance of 15 kilometers, adding up every step of the process, all of the path. And finally, what is her total displacement? Well, our initial position, she started at her home. Our final position, she ended up at her home. And if we look at our displacement, our final minus our initial, we see 0 minus 0, or if her roommate was sleeping the whole time, would have said she didn't go anywhere. Her displacement, where she ended up relative to where she started, was indeed 0. So really kind of fleshing out all the possible scenarios and comparing distance versus displacement, paying attention to a couple of things, and that is that direction. So in our example between 2B and C, they had the same magnitude, the same amount, but they were in opposite directions, so their displacements are different because of that direction, as opposed to when we look at distance and we don't care about direction. All right, good job.